All right, we are ready for our next speaker. Our next speaker is Dr. Scott Masson. Dr. Masson has written widely in his areas of research interest in British and European Romanticism, poetics, intellectual history, literary theory, cultural apologetics, education, and hermeneutics. He is a member of the Upper Mohawk Band and promotes truth and reconciliation as vital aspects of his life calling. He served for years in urban pastoral ministry in Toronto. That's in Canada. He is a regular conference and campus speaker, as well as appearing on television and radio. He was the founding board chairman of Westminster Classical Christian Academy in Toronto and remains involved in advancing classical education in Canada. He also works at Tyndale University. He is a proud husband and father of two. Please welcome Dr. Scott Masson. There you are. Thank you.
Thanks so much. For the record, it's Masson, not to take issue. I've never had it right my whole life, so I am not offended. I just, for the record, I'll say my own name right. So thank you so much. It's great to be here and to speak at such an important summit on what I think is a very important topic, which is Christian education. Christian education, I believe, is implicated in the Great Commission to go out and make disciples of all nations, not just baptizing them, but teaching them. And that aspect goes not only for pastoral ministry, but also for universities, for schools. The education mandate, the cultural mandate, which is implicit in that, it goes back as far as Genesis. The first commandment given to Adam and Eve is to be fruitful and multiply and fill and subdue the earth, and to exercise dominion over it and all the beasts therein. That includes not just the authority over those creatures, but also includes to exercise dominion over their own minds and over their own bodies, and to cultivate it, to make what God has created better. And the way you make it better is by loving the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, which Adam and Eve singularly failed to do when they broke the first commandment. My question here is the Psalm 11, which cited earlier, troubled me. As I was preparing to come here this week, Charlie Kirk was assassinated on a university campus, and it made me think about how I would present my subject today in the light of that. The question the psalmist writes is, if the foundations be destroyed, what can the righteous do? It's a hypothetical question there, although it's a question that actually is there embedded in many of the Psalms of lament, the Psalms of suffering, that the righteous seem to suffer and the unrighteous to flourish. And it seems like God is absent. I said it seems like, it doesn't mean that he is. But that's the perception. I cite that because in our own day, in universities, in schools, we are hearing phrases like this: 2 + 2 = 4 is white supremacist math. And language is violence. These are not, these are the phrases of radicals and not of most academics or teachers, for which we're thankful at this stage. However, what we also observe is that there is a significant number of people that are not speaking out against them and seem complicit in allowing people to say things that are wholly irrational and impossible to verify, and which they themselves can't possibly believe, and yet they assert. And one of the things I'm going to want to begin with in looking at this topic of worldview through my discipline being English literature and how I address it through Christian worldview teaching in English, is that problem which vexes me. Why is it that in the assassination of Charlie Kirk, the overwhelming majority stayed on the sidelines and spoke neutrally, and some saw it as a martyrdom of a sort, which I certainly did, but many didn't want to say that, and these were many of them were Christians. How come? Why is that? And I think I want to propose to you that it's an issue of worldview. But it goes more deeply than the discussions of worldview have been presented thus far. It goes all the way down to the issue of language. So the problem with the worldview is it makes us look at the big picture. The word worldview is a German word, which we've put biblical as an adjective to describe it, but it's not a biblical term per se. Weltanschauung is a 19th century German term, probably in Hegel, and to counteract that, we have sought to find a biblical worldview, which is a right thing to do. The term is still slightly problematic, but the idea of a comprehensive understanding of the world is surely correct. All the same, in the establishment's failure to denounce Charlie Kirk's assassin, I see a problem in language which I, as a specialist in literary theory, have been tracing throughout my academic career. I came to faith between my master's and my PhD, by the way, under Britain's foremost deconstructionist at the time, at least in my opinion, and had to wrestle with my newfound faith on my own in a university, the University of Durham, a very good university, but not exactly in our day, certainly not in the field of English literature, known for cleaving to Christian doctrine as the foundation for its understanding of the discipline. I had to figure that out for myself, and it's taken me a long time to do it, because I had no mentors in my life that were equipped to do that. And as I've found over the course of time, there aren't probably any. There are a few that go before me, and I've greatly benefited from their work. One of them is C.S. Lewis, of course, and J.R.R. Tolkien. And there are other scholars that I don't have time here to mention. But by and large, I have had to think through these things myself. And one of the chief problems is the lack of knowledge of literary theory. And I say that because most Christians are going to say that literary theory is something that is antithetical to Christian views, which is true. In its contemporary rendition, literary theory is opposed to a Christian worldview in every respect, and the reason it is because it has a view of language which is not just anti-Christian, but anti-human. And I want to talk about that right away at the outset, because I'm going to identify one individual because I think he's the most significant one, but I could talk about a whole array of postmodern literary theorists from the 60s onwards, but the man I want to identify is Michel Foucault. Now, Michel Foucault, according to Google Scholar, has over 1.4 million citations, which, if you want to get a sense of the scope there, that's roughly 75% more than any other author in history. Now, in terms of comparison, only the Bible has more influence in Western culture than Foucault by that measure. And of course, in our day, the scholars are mentioning Foucault and they're not mentioning Scripture. In fact, and I think there's a relation there. And it's not just because they're anti-Christian, although they are. It's because they oppose his view of language. And because of their adherence to Foucault's view of language, they have an understanding of what words do and how to engage in language, and how to understand rationality, which is so deeply embedded that it isn't even manifesting itself as anti-Christian, although it sometimes does do that. It manifests itself as an assault on human nature, including their own human nature. So let me talk about that a little bit before I come to my main talk. There are two main views of language that I'm going to identify here. One is a humanistic theory of language, under which we're also going to include a Christian view. Humanistic theories of language all emphasize the inherent potential of human individuals to communicate and express themselves rationally within a moral social order rooted in the family. My first study, when I come to look at Homer's Odyssey, I'm going to demonstrate this to you. Christian human adds to it and intensifies this by saying that language is a divine gift that reflects human dignity and a unique gift to communicate meaningfully, rationally, and knowledgeably. And it emphasizes in Christian teaching, furthermore, that language should be used with wisdom to express love, truth, and the moral values rooted in Christian teaching. And so the whole of the classical and Christian tradition of a university, which is, by the way, I'm sure you all know this, a medieval Christian institution, is rooted in a humanistic theory of language. Now, I call it that because post-1960s, we have what I'm going to identify as something opposed to that, and that is an anti-humanistic theory of language. An anti-humanistic theory of language, such as Foucault's view, holds that traditional views of language and humanity are to be opposed and jettisoned as utterly false. He's going to argue that these are historically relative, shaped by social and ideological factors, and the family as a unit is inherently patriarchal, and it imposes a moral order that has to be opposed because it's an oppressive social construct. You can see it has commonalities with Marxism in this, the idea of oppressor and oppressed. And they will explicitly, as a result of that, reject individual human dignity, reason, and objective knowledge, and consistently emphasize the power dynamic in language wielded by individuals that appeal to those very things, like Charlie Kirk did. He did witness to the gospel. He also regularly appealed to individual reasoning and a moral order, get married, and so forth. The whole shebang was included in Charlie's witness. All of those things, always. I think it was a Christian worldview. Let me illustrate this to you in a way. In George Orwell's 1984, the main character, Winston Smith, declared that freedom is the freedom to say that 2 + 2 make 4. If that is granted, all else follows. It's a strange sort of statement. And Orwell himself, who wrote it, is not a conservative. He was a left, a figure of the political left when he wrote it. But he realized that when we denigrate language in a totalitarian state, that we also denigrate people. The one follows from the other. And in an anti-humanistic view of knowledge, 2 + 2 equaling 4 will not be tolerated. Note that how much it's like Orwell's contention, and one Norwegian academic on the state broadcaster NRK compared Charlie Kirk to the far-right terrorist Anders Breivik, who shot his opponents in mass numbers. And Kirk was shot, and yet he compared the two. Now, this is an extraordinary thing, and what it shows is a certain view of language that is not only there on the radical left, but also those who won't contradict them. And what are those views of language? Well, they reflect an Aristotelian concept of the 3 laws of thought, and they're sometimes called the laws of logic. They're very easy. One is the law of identity. X equals X. The second is the law of non-contradiction. X does not equal Y. And the third is the law of the excluded middle. It's either this or that. It can't be anything in between. Now, in our contemporary gender ideology, we hear that a male can be a female. So the law of identity is broken, the law of non-contradiction also broken, and in the third case, the law of the excluded middle, if you don't regard the first two as problematic and won't end up in the other, you're contradicting the third. Now, if you have this view of language, you don't think that language is an expression of rational individual thought and an expression of moral character. You see language as basically a symbol, a type of sign language. It signifies certain things, it symbolizes certain things, and it symbolizes things that you don't like. But because of that, and also because of its view of human nature, that we identify ourselves and we give rise to our own identities, which is expressed in gender identity ideology, if people do not acknowledge our signification of ourselves, they're effectively also refusing to acknowledge our human identity, our human nature. So they're effectively condemning us to death. And so it is an existential fight that the left has forged around the issues of language, and hence compulsory language codes, which are presented in the diversity, equity, inclusion type of legislation that is so much a part of my country's ideology and government bureaucracy policies, and also your own. They're all there around the world, connected to the Agenda 2030 that we saw in an earlier speaker's talk. With that in mind, it's impossible to persuade somebody if they think that words themselves are violence. If they don't think that words, and for the moderates who also have been schooled by Foucault and his disciples, who think that language is not a rational act of identification through which we communicate and come to a common understanding and can come to a common understanding of human values and a common ground, we end up having people on either sides of the political divide signaling certain things, and the other side seeing this as a signal of war, and they rage. And they get involved in what George Orwell calls a 2 minutes of hate, where they simply shout their violence at the perpetrator of the indignity. And that's what's happening right now on the left, but it's also the moderates that are going along with that. But because of this view of human language that Foucault and his disciples have presented for 40-odd years in the university, so almost everybody that you know who's an adult and who has gone to a university, including Christian universities, has a faulty view of language. They have an anti-humanistic view of language. Otherwise, they would be happy to debate their opponents and reason with them and dispute error and regard truth and falsehood as matters of the utmost importance in the university, just like Martin Luther did when he pinned the 95 Theses to the Wittenberg door. Note that Luther was not a pastor, he was a university professor. But the universities of our day are not doing what Luther did. And the Charlie Kirks of the world are. And that's itself rather interesting as well. But I wanted to begin with that reflection and the problem here. The problem isn't just of worldview, it's of our very basic sense of the currency of education. And there are two main currencies in education. One is the word and the other is the number. Those are two ways that we apprehend reality. They're reflected in the liberal arts curriculum historically. The 7 liberal arts, the grammar, logic, rhetoric, the word arts, and arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy in the quadrivium. Those are the arts of number. With those 7 liberal arts, under the tutelage of theology, we master all fields of knowledge. If we lose the capacity for words to do what words do, namely identify things and grammatically express personhood and number, as soon as you lose that, you lose the whole of the education system. It's not about just recovering a Christian perspective on it. You lose the very basis for any possible knowledge. So language is not a small area of concern for specialists like me. Literary theory, whether we're interested in it or not, it's interested in you, and it's coming into your discipline. I saw it in my discipline of English first, because that's where it began, and then it bled over into theology, and then into the social sciences, probably concurrently, and now it's even in the sciences, which people never thought would happen, because they said, how would you do this in math? Well, 2 + 2 is white, patriarchal, racist math. You can't do it because it doesn't make sense, but still words are the means by which we communicate. So we can't just sort of cordon off the sciences from the contagion that's come into the humanities. We have to recover a view of the word and then bring that back into the whole university endeavor. Now, I'm going to talk about how we do that in my discipline, but I wanted to say that what I'm saying here is not confined to my discipline. The significance of understanding the word rightly is essential to recover all of the other disciplines. And that's because we're made in the image of God, and God himself is the word. So start with that. Hopefully you're not like this guy holding his head there. That's Satan, by the way, so you are not like that guy, but taken from Milton's Paradise Lost. Let's see if I can work this. Okay, I know what I wanted to do with this. So this is an image taken from the Renaissance. It's to illustrate what I'm talking about and where we're going to begin with, as I do with my undergraduates when I'm teaching them a Christian worldview through literature. And I do it chiefly through the epic. I start with this sort of visualization for them. This is from the Renaissance. We have the Madonna and the Child here. Note that they are front and center in a sort of a triangular portrait. The background is the background. We're not really paying much attention to it, and it's not actually greatly important to the portrait either, right? Front and center, your focus is front and center. This is Italian Renaissance, probably 15th century, thereabouts. This is a famous painting by a German painter, Caspar David Friedrich, called The Wanderer, that expresses the view of humanity that emerges after the Enlightenment into the Romantic period. And I want you to note a few things about the portrait which are striking. I've seen this used to promote Christian things all the time, by the way, because we're on the summit of a mountain. Moses was on a mountain, so all mountains are alike and so forth. Note that he has his back turned to you. Note that his attention is focused on the background. And we who, although we see him, we see from his perspective, look into the background. We look where he's looking. And our attention is drawn to something that is misty, murky in the distance, and we stand at the pinnacle of human civilization, reflecting the worldview of the progressive Enlightenment that thinks that it stands at the pinnacle of human history, at the pinnacle of rationality, and is putting aside the self-imposed tutelage to the past, which Immanuel Kant, in his treatise on enlightenment, says characterized previous education. We have to dare to know. And daring to know means knowing new things and not being shackled to the teaching of the church or the tradition or anything like that. We're going to look onwards and upwards. We're like this guy. And I say this guy with some hesitation because we're not even sure it is a man. I'm quite sure it is. But we can't see his face. He's wearing something that could disguise his sexuality here. The point is you can put yourself in his place there because we don't see his face. Here we see the face, and we said the attention is drawn on the Christ child that's actually pointing to his mother to the Bible, interestingly. Right? The center of this portrait is the child looking up to the mother, and the child nonetheless pointing down to the Word, and the Word's pointing to the Father, the Son is pointing to the Word pointing upward to a figure that we can't see in the portrait. This, on the other hand, reflects a new view of human nature which becomes prevalent in literature from this period onward. That is the 19th century, and that is the view of the hero of the story as an orphan. Basically, every literary figure from the 19th century onward is an orphan. From Bronte's stories to Victor Frankenstein in Frankenstein, to Charles Dickens novels, to Anne of Green Gables in my country, to James Bond, to all the superheroes of Marvel, to Harry Potter, to pretty much every popular literary figure presented to children and in novels and in culture, every hero is an orphan. Now, you would think that this was an accident if it didn't happen every time. Since you see it happens every time, you have to get some significance from this. What is the worldview embedded in presenting an orphan as our hero? And it's clear that it is this, that we no longer look to the past to guide us, where we have to direct our own development going forward. We need to educate ourselves. And so we get child-centered learning that arises out of this. And the other thing that this does, this portrait here, is it makes us think and feel what this man must be feeling, because he's looking into the distance, and this is a sublime landscape. It evokes awe in the beholder, including us. And that becomes the main subject of the orphan. The orphan is in awe of the greatness that lies within him. Spider-Man, Superman, Harry Potter, whatever, they are told to look within themselves and find the power within them that will lead them onward and upward. They're not told to look to God. They're not told to look to their families. They don't have families. They are told to look to themselves. Now, that idea of a self-directed humanity becomes the ideal and becomes the worldview of our culture. And with a Foucauldian view of language, which I described earlier, that self-identifying orphan is going to determine his own gender identity, his own sexual identity through his natural proclivities, and furthermore, nobody can tell that person that he's wrong, because the feelings comes within, the tutelage comes within, and the words come within, and the words themselves, they say, are a means of power. That's what Foucault teaches. They're not a means of communication. They're not a means of using reason. They're not a means of expressing love and community. They're not a means that God has used through the person of his Son to redeem the world. They're none of these things. They're an act of power. That's what words are. And if I don't use my words to express my power, I'm going to be crushed by others' words. And so they will fight tooth and nail over language. So language is at the center of the culture wars, and I hear nobody actually identifying this as clearly as it needs to be identified. It's a deeply rooted issue of theories of language that are either humanistic or anti-humanistic. Now, the best humanistic theories include the God who became man, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, full of grace and truth. That's the best representation of this. And it's an expression, as I say, of this passage that expresses the cultural mandate, the dominion mandate. And it reflects not only our understanding here of human nature. This is a very cryptic phrase here, in the image of God. What does it actually mean? It's not explained in the text. It requires later text to flesh it out. And I'm going to look at a couple of the texts that help us do that. But one of the first things that we notice about the Genesis text is that God speaks. Unlike the idols of the ancient Near East, who never speak, but God speaks, and when he speaks, he orders. And when he orders, he pronounces what he orders good. And he distinguishes, separates, contrasts, tells Adam to do so. But then his first commandment is a commandment. He commands Adam. What do we get from that? First of all, because God never speaks to the animals, he creates them but doesn't speak to them, that the capacity to understand speech and to use speech is an attribute of being made in the image of God. Secondly, God giving the command to us entails that we're able to understand, and we're responsible for responding to the command of God. Therefore, we are not only able to respond, we're responsible to God. Those are entailments of this narrative. And the third is that we are to exercise dominion over the earth through our words as well as through our deeds, not just through agriculture and other means of culture, but specifically through the culture of words and the culture of language and the culture of education, the tools of my trade, the trade of words. But it's all manner of culture. But this one is central because it's central to who God is. Because remember, God is not a physical being. Another aspect of this is that there is light and darkness involved in this. I'm not going to read it because I'll run out of time. I went on a bit too long at the beginning. And in this, we see that he was not the light, but bore witness to the light, he being John. But the true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. Speaking of Christ, who was in the beginning, and who was the Word. The word here in Greek is logos rather. And the entailment of that is logic, rationality, for which reason one of the first definitions of person that we have from Boethius is that a person is an individual substance of a rational nature. Rationality is a part of human being. If you deny rationality to human nature, you remove one of the key features of that humanity has to reflect God's imprint on us. And our contemporaries' use of language denies that categorically. This is a great problem for us. One of the ways we can respond to it is through love, because this is an even clearer understanding of who God is and how he operates. So when Jesus is asked what the greatest commandment is, what does he say? He cites the Shema, Deuteronomy 6. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. You're to love the Lord with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then you're to teach it to your children, because your children need to know about the Exodus, etc. You're to put it on your forehead, on your wrists. You're to put it on the doorposts of your home, and you're to put it on the gates of your city. In other words, it reflects your thoughts and your deeds and your domestic sphere and your civic sphere. In other words, it's total. It's a worldview. But note that it's marked by love. This is the particular Christian teaching of a humanistic view of language, but it's so central to Christian teaching. It is humanistic, but it defines humanity in terms of the God-man who is himself love. Now, this then gets passed on through the Christian tradition when Paul speaks in Ephesians 6, verse 4, and says to fathers to educate their children and bring them up in the fear and admonition of the Lord. The word fear there is paideia. Now, the word paideia in Greek refers to a total enculturation. It's total. It includes all of the things that the Shema referred to, right? So we need to recover. If people are not receiving rationality or receive it as a hostile act, then they need to see the face of love much more so. I admired Charlie Kirk so much for that, quite frankly. I've been in that sort of situation. It's very difficult to do what he did for those who want to be critics. I've watched a fair bit of video of him now, and I'm full of admiration for his witness and his character. He's a 31-year-old man. Like, it's not easy at any time, but as a young man to respond to that with the grace and love, he was gifted by God to do that. But this passage is commented on by one of the early church fathers, whose name is Origen, on First Principles. His comment is this: truly he is that light which illuminates the whole understanding of those who are capable of receiving truth. As is said in Psalm 36, in thy light we shall see light. For what other light of God can be named in which anyone sees light, save an influence of God by which a man being enlightened either thoroughly sees the truth of all things, or comes to know God himself, who is called the truth, such is the meaning of the expression, in thy light we see light. That is, in thy word and wisdom, which is thy Son, in himself we shall see thee, the Father. Great comment. The light which comes and is a supernatural gift. We can't just recover rationality. We need to recover the spirit-given illumination of the Word. And we can't abandon the Word in the name of spirituality, and we can't abandon spirituality in the name of the Word. The two go together. We need to pray for those who oppose us. Christian education does involve prayer as well as teaching. You need sound doctrine. We also need Christian life and witness in all things. And that is because even though we are made in the image of God, it says in Colossians 1 that Jesus is the image of God. He's not in the image, he is the image of God. So if you want to see what a human being is like, don't look to Adam in the garden. Look to Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane. Look to that one in the garden. And he is the image of God, the first of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, and all things are in him and for him, and in him all things hold together. And I'll skip over Origen's comment on this. I can put it on the site here. And therefore, the call for Christian education is Romans 12, verse 2, to, what have I got? Okay. No longer be conformed to the pattern of this world, but rather be transformed by the renewal of your mind. No longer to be conformed by the pattern of this world. The assumption there is that we actually are naturally conform to the pattern of this world. We are hostile to God, at enmity with God. We have a hostile worldview. We have to be transformed by the renewal of our mind, and specifically the person and work of Jesus Christ, who is loving in his ways. That has to be the spirit of the educator. Now, I try to do this in my own teaching here, and put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge after the image of the Creator, Colossians 3, verse 10. And destroy strongholds, false teaching, and so forth. All of these are necessary. Apologetics, you have to dispute the falsehood and not just present the light. You have to contend, fight, hold back the darkness as well as hold up the light. But the way I do it is through education in worldview. So I'm going to spend the remaining bits of my time here. When did I begin? No, I've still got a few minutes. Good. In talking about how I do this through worldview. So everything that I've just said to you, I say to my students, not all at once because it's a little heavy. I assume that my audience would be with me already and they could follow what I was saying more or less. I didn't have to go through it in baby steps and didn't have to present it a bit here and a bit here and a bit all around. But if it was too much, I apologize. But I do it through the epic. So I teach every year, first year English, and I was hired by Discovery to do this for others as well. It's being disseminated in various platforms now through their ministries and so forth, is through the epic. And let me say a bit about the features of an epic and why I use the epic. The epic is the means, the genre through which the ancient world taught paideia, worldview. A totally all-inclusive genre that expressed the greatest teaching and the greatest example. Homer was called the teacher of all the Greeks. Everyone in the ancient Greek world would cite Homer as if he were scripture. They would hear him in assembly. A singer would stand and he would recite by memory Homer. And Homer was referred to adjudicate between different parties on what the right way to conduct oneself was in relation to all manner of things, because in the epic we are given an account of the gods, we're given an account of people on earth, and we're given an account of the afterlife and of death and the underworld. Now in Christian iterations of this, the realm of the gods gets transformed so that we get heaven. So in Milton's Paradise Lost, which I eventually get to, we will see a very different portrait of God than that of Homer and the ancient world. We will also get a very different understanding of the underworld. Milton calls it hell. But his whole, if you read Paradise Lost, and if you haven't, you should. It's one of the great works. It is the great work of the English language. And it is expressed by a Puritan writing using an epic form to proclaim the supremacy of the Word of God in all things, and to tell the greatest story that's ever been told, in the form of an epic. Now you can just appeal to Scripture to tell you that, but he distills it and presents it in an epic form to an audience whom he wants to give a all-inclusive, all-encompassing paideia from the Christian perspective. But I begin by acquainting them with the features and marks of an epic to begin with. And I start with Homer's Odyssey. Let me say something about Homer's Odyssey and the backstory that underlies Homer's Odyssey. And it's this story here that I've got on the screen behind me. This is told in the Iliad, book 24, right at the end of it. It's a really funny placement for it. At the very conclusion of the Battle of Troy and the Achilles slaying his opponent Hector and so forth and dragging him around the city 3 times, we're given this little story of the judgment of Paris. And it actually underlies all of the Greek epics, this account of what happened between 3 goddesses. So Eris, the goddess of discord, was not invited to a wedding. The wedding of Peleus and Thetis. And in revenge, she brought a golden apple, and inscribed on the golden apple is "to the fairest one," and she throws it in the middle of the 3 goddesses. And then the 3 goddesses proceed to fight amongst themselves, because she's the goddess of discord, over which one of them is the fairest. And of course, the reason you don't invite discord to your wedding is pretty obvious. You want it to be a celebration and not a battle royale. But her vengeance is that she throws the golden apple in the midst of them, and the three goddesses then proceed to fight. They can't solve their quarrel, because none of them will give ground. So they look at this poor individual, whose name is Paris, and say, you get to decide for us. Which one of us is the fairest? And to persuade him to side with her, they offer him things. Now, Hera offers him government, power, authority. Athena offers him wisdom. Aphrodite offers him sex. It's a measure of the man that he chooses beauty and sexual desire and is rewarded with Helen of Troy as his prize. It's a measure of Paris's low appetitive worldview that drives him to make a bad choice in amongst the three. Now, it didn't matter what choice he made, by the way, the war would still have ensued, but it was incited by an understanding of love that was driven more by the pelvis than by a higher view of love, which we are acquainted with in Scripture. But that ensues, that battle underlies the whole of the Battle of Troy. The Greeks who have Athena behind them, and the Trojans who have Aphrodite behind them. Aphrodite is overthrown, her city is destroyed. From that battle, we get the Odyssey. Because the man at the center of the Odyssey's name is Odysseus, and Odysseus is the human personification of wisdom. And in this account, this is what I tell my students, in this account of the Odyssey, we have an account which has a parallel, for those of you who are Christians, with the account given of wisdom in Proverbs. Because in Proverbs 1 to 9, we see two figures calling out in the streets, one who is Lady Wisdom and the other who is a Lady of Folly. And the Lady of Folly is an adulteress, and she leads you down to ruination. She leads you down to hell. And then she feeds on you. Terrible consequence. Here we have a man who is faithful and wise, Odysseus, and yet he is not being rewarded for his wisdom. So the whole of the Odyssey begins with a problem caused by the battle of the gods, in which wisdom is going to come to the solution of her hero, Odysseus. And it happens this way. This is the way it's portrayed. Now, stories, if you want to think about stories begin historically, chronologically. It begins with this, and then this, and then this. That's not the same as what a plot is. A plot is the arrangement of the story. And the arrangement in the Odyssey is, it begins in Odysseus's house. We don't even see Odysseus. We have no idea where the hero Odysseus is. It's all about Odysseus, by the way, but it begins with a portrait of a man whose house is the central focus right at the beginning of the story. And why does it do this, I ask my students? Why do we look at the man's house? And the answer is because we then see the portrait of what happens in a house where the man is not present, and wisdom is left to the defenses of only the wife and the son, and the devastating consequences of an absentee father. And it's also the story, though, of Odysseus overcoming the trials and suffering that he must endure in order to fix that portrait of domestic discord. Because that is what we have in books 1 to 4 here, is a portrait of a broken family. We have a young man who's 20 years old, who's never seen his father, who looks like his father. Everyone says, you look like the mighty Odysseus, and he says, that's what everyone tells me, but it doesn't feel him, it doesn't encourage him, it makes him think, and I'm nothing like that man. I don't have his courage, I don't have his wherewithal in battle, I don't even know how to conduct myself as a man. And so he's sitting there, not knowing how to act. And wisdom comes in, that is Athena, in the guise of an old man, and the old man's name is mentor. You ever heard of a mentor? Christians talk about it all the time. It's not a biblical word. You will not find the word mentor in Scripture. You will find it in the Odyssey. A mentor is a wise old man. Athena comes in the guise of an older man and tells Telemachus what to do, to start things off. So wisdom directs the son. Penelope is also a portrait of wisdom. In fact, his whole family are portraits of wisdom in the Odyssey, but wisdom that has been assailed by evil and is broken up. And the kingdom that ensues when evil assaults a family and destroys the domestic harmony and also the governance of the whole civilization, because Ithaca is a kingdom gone to seed. There is no justice in Ithaca while Odysseus has gone away. But by the time of the conclusion of the story, when he comes back home, he rectifies this, and there's a sort of an apocalypse in which wisdom avenges the injustice that is done to the household of Odysseus. And Telemachus, the boy that began as an orphan, is now a man who fights alongside of his father and defeats injustice and cleaves to his father's example. And Penelope, being a Proverbs wife who is faithful to him throughout being restored to her husband, we get something like a story of domestic harmony. Now, this is one of the great epics of the ancient world, told from the vantage point of a polytheist, which exemplifies wisdom as the substance of paideia, of good education. I would say that Christians can learn from the Odyssey. What they won't learn is who God is. And that wisdom has to be coupled with truth, because Odysseus and Athena and all the goddesses and all the others there spend their time throughout the epic lying. To be wise is to deceive your opponents, to hide yourself, to never be truthful, never represent yourself. Now, Christians are going to reinterpret the epic and represent it as greatness, but they want the paideia, they want the holistic view. We begin with this, and then I move on forward through that. But you begin with what is great, what is epic. It's always been wisdom. What is true wisdom? It's wisdom that will be represented in truth, etc. I see that I am out of time or close to it. I wanted to take questions. Do I have time for questions? No, I've shot my mark.
A couple of questions.
Okay, I apologize. I had in mind I don't have a clock.
You were earlier discussing Foucault and power, which reminded me immediately there is a translation of Machiavelli's The Prince by an Italian-American, brilliant work, Angelo Codevilla. He had a commentary that included a section on words and power. And I was just thinking how much of what you are saying is illustrated. I might mention that Machiavelli himself strongly influenced, or reading Machiavelli, influenced Antonio Gramsci.
The cultural Marxist, Gramsci, yes.
And Codevilla, who wrote about our ruling class, it was entitled The Ruling Class, I think definitely had his finger on what's wrong in this country, that we are following a Machiavellian approach to things. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I do. I'm not sure they can be brief, although I'll do my best to be brief. So, in the early 19th century, theology was thrown out of the public universities. And in response to that, because the debasement of theology in the form of religious studies as a social science, as it were, form of culture and anthropology was unacceptable to Christians, they started seminaries. And we get the Bible school theology seminary movement, which was very good for retaining theological rigor, but it lost worldview in the process because the university reflected the theological application to all fields. And so once theology is out of the university, you don't preserve theology by just holding on to theology. You have to have Christian universities in which theology is centered in it. If you don't, you have a view of language in which human language and the study of the word are severed. you need a holistic view of language, which you can only get by exposure to the Word of God in the context of the university applied through. We're living through the consequences of something that happened in the French Revolution and thereafter. So language is now perceived as an act of power and aggression. Deeply problematic. Can't be recovered immediately, except by the Spirit of God.
One more.
In 1996, I was at a UN conference in Istanbul with an NGO. We were lobbying against the Women's Caucus that was empowered by the Clinton administration. We were actually lobbying against our own US government because they were, and I believe they were successful, but in 1996, they sought at that conference to do a global lexicon change of every UN document from the word sex to gender. And we argued, of course people were baffled that that could mean anything beyond men and women. My concern is that as a Christian community, we've adopted the lexicon.
We have.
Far beyond just government usage.
Yes.
It's commonplace for Christian leaders to use the word gender, which is a loaded term,
Yes.
and means all kinds of things. And my husband rails about the, in the United States, the switch from red state to red state and blue state, which reversed, because globally it was always Labor Party, Communist Party.
True.
And we've all gone along with the change in the lexicon. So, when are we going to, as a Christian community, start recapturing the language?
Well, I don't know. I fought the same fight. I refuse to use the language of Mordor, the dark speech, myself. I don't think that we bless anyone by holding on to false categories. Mark spoke earlier about education being only education and truth. I will not partake in propaganda, because I think that's, and confusion, because it is inherently confusing. It's impossible to rectify those two things. A gender identity, what even is that? A gender is what? What is that? I know what it is grammatically, perhaps. Male, female, nouns. You can talk about the gender of nouns, but you can't talk about the gender of people. That's again a literary theoretical term that's been smuggled in the church, saying, well, as long as we hold on to the gospel, we can give ground on this because we want people not to be offended. We want them to feel included, whatever. So yeah, it's a small inclusion and it doesn't cost much. I don't see it that way. I think the consequences are devastating and holding on to language, as we were told about the Webster's Dictionary, seems to me a very, very important thing to do. To recover words, the right words for the right things, is a recovery of the whole Western tradition, and including Christian. Christianity includes the culture of Christendom. You have to hold on to words rightly used. You can't just hold on to and point to Christ. You have to point to the right words that allow us to understand the world around us, including other human beings. It's not just a biological thing. It's deeper than that. The word is deeper than a biological reality. The chromosomal reality, that's true, of course. It's a consequence of the word. God names them male and female. The two together are in the image of God, but individually they are as well. He calls them male and female. We can't call them anything else. It confuses us. It harms us. It's diabolical. Anyway, I go on with that all day, and I'm done. I took too long, sorry.